The enemy commander laughed when his scouts reported only 12 Americans on the ridge. He actually laughed. He poured himself a cup of tea, looked at his officers, and said, "Kill them all before breakfast." He didn't send a warning. He didn't offer surrender terms. He just pointed at the mountain and told his men to erase every living soul defending it. Women, wounded, medics, nobody gets out. That order changed everything that happened next. If you've never heard the name Rachel Kane, you're about to understand why entire enemy battalions still argue about what happened on that ridge. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Staff Sergeant Rachel Kane had been awake for 31 hours by the time the transport helicopter dropped her unit onto the frozen face of Blackstone Ridge. The wind hit like a wall the moment she stepped off. Not the kind of cold that makes you pull your jacket tighter. The kind of cold that reaches through fabric, through muscle, straight down to the place where your confidence lives and starts squeezing. She didn't flinch. She pulled her rifle case off the cargo net, checked the snap locks with 2 fingers without looking down, and turned to face the ridge like she was reading a map she'd already memorized. Private First Class Danny Okafor stumbled off the helicopter behind her and immediately grabbed her sleeve. "Sergeant Kane," he said, his voice barely above the rotor noise. "Tell me this looks worse than it is." Rachel looked at him. She looked at the ridge, at the way the ice-covered rocks jutted out like broken teeth against a sky that had already started turning the color of a bruise, at the narrow paths that wound up through exposed snowfields where any advancing enemy would have full view of the defensive line, at the radar station sitting exposed and half-buried in drifts near the summit. She looked back at Danny. "It looks exactly like it is," she said. Danny closed his eyes for 1 full second. "That's what I was afraid of." She almost smiled. Almost. The platoon was 12 soldiers total. 6 had combat experience. 3 were medics, cross-trained for defensive operations. 2 were communications specialists who'd never fired in a live engagement outside of qualification ranges. And then there was Private Marcus Webb, 19 years old, who had volunteered for this deployment because he'd told his recruiter he wanted to see real action. Rachel had heard Marcus say that during the briefing and felt something cold move through her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. She'd seen what real action looked like up close. She'd held men while they died from it. Lieutenant Cole Mercer assembled the platoon at the base of the ridge's first switchback, snow already coating the shoulders of his jacket, and looked at the group the way a man looks at a hand of cards he knows isn't strong enough. "Listen up," Mercer said. "We hold this radar station for 48 hours minimum. Reinforcements are staged and moving, but weather-grounded air support. Resupply is not guaranteed. We operate on what we have." Silence. Then Corporal Tomas Reyes, a heavy-set man from San Antonio who kept a rosary wrapped around his wrist, raised his hand halfway. "Sir, what's the intel on hostile activity in the valley?" Mercer's jaw tightened. Scouts reported mercenary movement approximately 6 miles northeast. "Unknown numbers, unknown objective." "Unknown objective," Reyes repeated slowly. "Sir, respectfully, there's only one objective if they're heading this direction. That's us. Which is why we hold the ridge," Mercer said flatly. "Questions?" More silence. Rachel didn't raise her hand. She didn't ask anything. She was already studying the terrain above them, picking apart the ridge line in her mind, the same way a chess player disassembles a board, not looking at the pieces, looking at the spaces between them. There was a rock formation about 400 meters up the south face that created a natural blind. Someone positioned there with a clear optic could cover nearly the entire approach from the valley without being silhouetted against the sky. She made a mental note of it without writing anything down. Mercer dismissed the platoon to begin setting defensive positions. As the soldiers started climbing, he fell into step beside Rachel. "Kane," he said, his voice dropping so only she could hear, "I'm putting you in overwatch on the eastern ridgeline, primary observation post." "Understood," she said. He paused. She could feel him about to say something else. Something he'd been holding. "I'm going to be straight with you," Mercer said. "You're the best qualified for that position. But that ridge is going to be the first thing they try to collapse. If they hit us hard enough, I can't promise you backup." Rachel kept walking uphill. "You can't hold that position alone," Mercer said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite a warning and wasn't quite an apology. It sat somewhere in between. She stopped walking. She turned and looked at him directly, and Mercer had been around enough combat veterans to recognize the specific kind of calm she was projecting, the kind that isn't peace. It's just pressure that's been compressed so many times it stopped making noise. "When do we move out?" she asked. He searched her face for something. Doubt, fear, a crack in the exterior. He didn't find one. 200 hours, he said. Rachel nodded once and turned back up the mountain. What Mercer didn't know, what almost nobody in this platoon knew, was that Rachel Kane had already survived something that should have destroyed her. Not just physically, the kind of thing that reshapes a person's interior the way a fire reshapes metal. You come out harder in some places, and in other places, you come out missing parts entirely. 3 years earlier, in a classified operation across a border that officially didn't happen, Rachel had been part of a 6-person sniper team inserted into a mountain region of Eastern Europe to extract a defecting intelligence asset. The mission lasted 4 days. When it ended, only 2 people walked out. Rachel was one of them. The other man who survived never spoke about it publicly. Neither did she. The file was sealed. The families of the men who died received condolence letters that described training accidents in locations that didn't match any base on record. But Rachel remembered every detail. She remembered the moment the extraction went wrong, the moment she understood that the safe house had been compromised, the moment she had to make a decision, try to hold the position and wait for backup that wasn't coming, or break contact and move the asset out alone while the rest of her team bought time. She made the decision. She moved, and the men who stayed behind never came home. The logic of it was sound. Tactically, there was no other choice. Every instructor she'd ever trained under would have made the same call. She knew that. She told herself that more times than she could count, in more dark rooms, in more hours between 3 and 5 in the morning, when sleep refused to come. But logic and guilt don't always speak the same language. For 3 years, she'd been carrying 2 things, a rifle and the faces of 5 men who trusted her enough to stay behind so she could go forward. That weight was still there when she set up her observation post on Blackstone Ridge. It would be there for every hour of what was coming next. She positioned her rifle case behind a natural rock shelf, constructed a rudimentary hide using her white camouflage netting, and settled in to watch the valley below. The valley was wide and deep, carved by some ancient glacier into a shape that funneled wind and sound in strange directions. At the far end, almost invisible in the early storm haze, was the frozen mouth of a river that came down from the eastern mountains. That river delta was the only wide, flat approach that armored vehicles or large infantry units could use at speed. She noted it. She also noted 3 narrower routes up through the rock. Paths that a small, disciplined unit moving in single file could climb in the dark without being heard until they were almost at the top. She noted all 3. For an hour, nothing moved in the valley except snow. Then her radio crackled. It was Corporal Reyes checking in from the southern defensive line. "Kane, you see anything?" "Negative," she said. "Valley's clean. For now." "For now," Reyes repeated. "Love the confidence." "How are your fields of fire?" "Decent." Webb keeps repositioning himself every 5 minutes because he can't decide which direction he's most scared of. Rachel closed her eyes briefly. "Tell Webb to pick a position and stay in it. Movement in the dark makes you a target before you ever see the threat." "Copy," Reyes said. "Hey, Sergeant Kane." "Yeah. You ever been in a defensive action before held ground under sustained assault?" She was quiet for a moment. "Yes," she said. "How'd it go?" She thought about the mountain in Eastern Europe, about the sounds that came through her earpiece for 2 hours before they stopped, about standing on a runway in Germany 40 hours later, being debriefed by men in civilian clothes who kept saying the mission was a success. "We held," she said. "It wasn't entirely a lie." "Good enough for me," Reyes said. "Reyes out." She settled back into her position and watched the valley. She was still watching when Private Danny Okafor appeared behind her position about 2 hours later, moving quietly but not quietly enough. She heard his boots on the rock 12 steps before he appeared. "You're loud," she said without turning around. "Sorry," Danny said. He crouched beside her, hide his breath misting in the cold. "Lieutenant wants a full assessment of approach vectors, visual confirmation before he adjusts the defensive plan. Tell him 3 viable infantry approach routes on the western face, all of them narrow. 1 wide vehicle approach along the frozen river delta, currently obscured by storm, but will be visible once the wind direction shifts around 0300. Tell him if they're professional, they hit the narrow roads first to draw our attention while something heavier comes up the delta. Danny was writing in a small notebook, his fingers stiff with cold. How do you know they'll do it in that order? Because that's how I do it, Rachel said. Danny stopped writing and looked at her. How long have you been a sniper? He asked. 7 years. And before that, infantry. So you've done this from both sides? Yes. Danny sat quiet for a moment, the wind pushing at his jacket, his notebook getting dusted with fine snow. Then he said something that surprised her. Are you scared? Rachel kept her eyes on the valley. Most soldiers asked her about her kill count, about what her longest confirmed shot was, about whether it was different for a woman, a question she despised not because it was inappropriate, but because it revealed what the person asking actually believed, which was that her gender was the most interesting thing about her. Nobody asked if she was scared. Yes, she said. Danny blinked. You don't look it. Looking scared doesn't help anything, and she said. Being scared is honest. Staying anyway is the job. Danny absorbed this. He looked out over the valley at the enormous dark and the endless snow and the invisible distance where somewhere out there men were moving toward them with weapons and orders. I've never been in combat before, Danny said. Not real combat. I've done training, I've done exercises, but this, he stopped, swallowed. This is real. Yes, Rachel said, it is. Does it get easier after the first time? She thought about the answer carefully, the way she always thought about things she was going to say out loud that mattered. Some parts, she said, the mechanical parts. The training takes over and you stop thinking and you just execute. That gets easier. She paused. The other parts don't get easier. They just get quieter. Danny nodded slowly like he was memorizing the words. Go give the lieutenant my assessment, Rachel said, and Danny, put your glove liners back on. Frostbite on your trigger hand is a bad way to start the night. Danny looked down at his hands and immediately started pulling his liners on. How did you go? She said. He went. She was alone again. For a while, the only sounds were wind and the faint creak of ice settling somewhere far below. She ran her fingers along the barrel of her rifle the way some people touch rosary beads, not for luck, not for comfort exactly, but for the feeling of something solid when everything else is uncertain. She thought about the men she'd lost. She thought about their faces. She didn't push the thoughts away. She'd learned a long time ago that pushing those thoughts away just made them louder in the quiet. So she let them come. She sat with them for a few minutes like she was sitting with people she owed something to. Then she let them settle. And she focused. Because somewhere in the valley below, she could see something that hadn't been there 20 minutes ago. She pressed her eye to the scope, adjusted for the wind. The storm haze was beginning to thin in one specific corridor of the valley, the western approach. And along that corridor, barely visible, almost swallowed by the dark and the snow, she could see the faint blink of infrared signal lights. 2 quick pulses, 1 long. 2 quick, 1 long. She knew that pattern. It wasn't random navigation. That was a coordination signal. The kind units used when they were dividing into multiple attack elements and confirming their positions relative to each other. They weren't scouting. They were already in position. She keyed her radio immediately. All stations. All stations. This is Kane on Overwatch. I have confirmed hostile activity. Western approach corridor, multiple infrared signals indicating unit coordination. They are already staged. This is not a probe. I say again, this is not a probe. A moment of static. Then Mercer's voice came back hard and fast. How many? Can't confirm yet. Signals suggest at least 3 separate elements. Could be more. Time to contact. If they're moving now, 20 minutes to the base of the ridge. Less if they're moving fast. Another pause. She could hear Mercer relaying orders in the background, voices sharpening up across the defensive line, the sound of soldiers shifting from waiting to ready. Kane, Mercer said, hold your position. Do not fire unless you have confirmed targets. Copy, she said. She settled back into her rifle. 20 minutes. She had 20 minutes before everything changed. She used every one of them. She mapped the approach corridor in her mind, distances, wind angles, likely movement patterns, the places where the terrain would funnel soldiers into tight lines that would make them easier to hit and harder to scatter. She calculated the shot sequence she would use if they came up the western face, then the southern face, then the Eastern. She built a mental file of contingencies so deep and so detailed that by the time the first shapes began appearing at the valley floor, she was ready in a way that wasn't emotional. It was mechanical. It was pure. It was the one gift the 3 years since Eastern Europe had given her the ability to step completely outside of herself in a moment of high danger, to shrink the entire world down to the size of a scope and function inside that space with an accuracy that still surprised the people who watched her work. She saw the first element moving up the western face in a staggered column. She counted. She breathed. She waited. "Lieutenant," she said quietly into the radio, "I have visual on lead element. Western face, approximately 22 confirmed hostiles moving in staggered formation. They have communications gear and at least 2 crew-served weapons in the element. I identify a drone operator third from the front distinctive antenna pack on the rig." "Hold fire," Mercer said. "Wait for my command." She waited. She watched the column move uphill. She watched them move with the confidence of soldiers who had been told the objective was lightly defended. She watched them, not looking up, scanning side to side, checking their flanks, but not up, not toward the ridge above. They didn't know she was there. She was a ghost to them. And then Mercer said, "Kane, weapons free." She exhaled slowly. The wind paused for one fraction of a second, the way wind sometimes does in the mountains, as if even the weather holds its breath. She fired. The drone operator went down first. Before his body finished falling, she was already cycling the bolt, already adjusting 14 inches for the second shot, already breathing out again. The second shot took out the lead element's communications man, the soldier carrying the heavy radio pack that would allow them to call in the armored support waiting in the valley. In the first 4 seconds of the engagement, Rachel Kane had removed the enemy's eyes and their voice. What followed next was chaos. But for Rachel, it was nothing but geometry. Target, distance, wind, breath, trigger. One after another, the enemy assault began coming apart at its edges. And far below, in the darkness of the frozen valley, the enemy commander who had laughed that morning and ordered his men to kill them all before breakfast, picked up his radio and heard something that confused him deeply. His lead assault element was collapsing, and none of his men could figure out where the shots were coming from. He asked his communications officer for a report. The communications officer looked at the radio and said very quietly, "Sir, the assault team's comms operator is down. I can't raise them." The commander stared at the ridge through his thermal scope. He wasn't laughing anymore. He started to wonder, just beginning to wonder, whether 12 Americans might not be the number he was actually fighting. Because on that ridge, in the dark and the wind and the blinding snow, one woman was fighting like an army, and she was just getting started. The first assault died in under 4 minutes. Not slowly, not with warning. It collapsed the way a wall collapses when the foundation goes first fast total and loud enough that everyone nearby felt it in their chest. Rachel had taken out 11 men before the remaining enemy fighters even understood which direction the shots were coming from. They scattered across the western face, pressing themselves against rocks, screaming into radios that no longer connected to anyone, because the man carrying their communications gear was already face down in the snow with a hole through his chest. Down on the defensive line, Corporal Thomas Reyes pressed himself against his position and listened. He could hear the shots from Rachel's overwatch, each one distinct, spaced by a breath, precise as a clock ticking. He counted 11. Then silence. He keyed his radio with a shaking hand. Kane, what is your status?" Her voice came back even. Calm, like she was reading from a manual. "Western faces neutralized. 11 confirmed down. Remaining hostiles have broken contact and are retreating to the valley floor. I estimate 8 to 10 survivors from the lead element." Reyes exhaled so hard his whole body shook. "You got 11 of them before they even returned fire." "They returned fire," Rachel said. "They just didn't know where to aim." Private Danny Okafor, crouched 3 meters from Reyes, looked up with eyes wide enough to show white all the way around. Did she just take out 11 guys by herself in like 4 minutes?" "Apparently," Reyes said. "In the dark, in a blizzard." "Danny," Reyes said quietly, "stop talking and check your sector." Lieutenant Mercer came across the radio 30 seconds later, his voice carrying the particular tightness of a man who had just recalculated everything he thought he knew about the next 48 hours. "Kane, excellent work. Can you confirm the retreat is genuine and not a feint?" Rachel was already watching. Retreat is genuine. They're moving fast and they're not coordinated. This wasn't how they planned to start the engagement. A pause. Lieutenant, they had a drone operator and a comms man in the lead element. I took both of them first. They've lost their forward observation capability for now. But that's temporary. They have support in the valley. They will regroup. How long? An hour, maybe less if their commander is smart. Mercer processed this. What do you need up there? Rachel's answer was immediate. Ammunition resupply. And tell whoever is on the south face to move the machine gun position 12 meters west. The way it's currently set up, it has a dead zone on the lower switchback. If a second element comes up from that angle, there's a gap. There was a pause on Mercer's end. How do you know where the machine gun is? Because I can see it from up here and it's wrong, she said without any edge in her voice, simply stating fact. Mercer relayed the order. The machine gun moved. Private Marcus Webb, the 19-year-old who had wanted to see real action, was the one who moved it. His hands were shaking so badly that Sergeant First Class Ortega had to help him reset the tripod. Ortega didn't say anything about the shaking. He just placed Webb's hands on the grip and said, "Breathe, just breathe and stay locked onto your sector." "How is she doing that?" Webb whispered. "How is she doing that alone up there?" "Because she's been doing it longer than you've been alive," Ortega said. "Now lock in." The hour that followed was the strangest kind of quiet that soldiers learned to dread. Not peaceful quiet, but held breath quiet. The kind that means something is coming and hasn't arrived yet. Rachel used every minute of it. She shifted her position twice, moving to different points along the ridgeline to map the valley below from different angles. She counted vehicle signatures through the snowstorm, using the faint heat bloom that armored engines threw even in the cold. She identified at least 3 armored vehicles holding position at the valley floor and 2 additional infantry elements that hadn't committed to the assault yet. She did all of this alone, and she was doing it while a thin line of blood ran down the inside of her sleeve from a rock fragment that had caught her forearm during the first exchange. She hadn't mentioned it on the radio. She pressed a strip of tape against it without breaking her observation rhythm and kept working. Reyes called up 40 minutes into the quiet. "Kane, you eating anything up there?" "No." "You should eat something." "Noted." "That wasn't a suggestion, Sergeant." She actually paused at that. Then, "Are you mothering me, Corporal?" "I'm maintaining combat effectiveness across the whole unit," Reyes said. "That includes you. Webb ate 2 energy bars in the last 20 minutes. He stress eats. I'm not judging, but you should eat something." Despite everything, despite the cold and the blood and the weight sitting inside her chest, Rachel felt something that almost resembled warmth move through her. "I have a protein bar in my left pocket," she said. "I'll eat it." "Good," Reyes said. "I'll stop bothering you." "You won't," she said. "No, he agreed. "I won't." She ate the protein bar without taking her eye off the valley. 53 minutes after the first assault collapsed, the enemy moved again. Rachel saw it first. The armored vehicles at the valley floor began repositioning not toward the western face, not the approach they had used before. They were angling toward the frozen river delta, the wide, flat approach she'd identified hours ago, the one she'd told Mercer about. At the same time, she picked up movement on the southern face. Infantry moving in a different pattern than before. Tighter, more disciplined. Not the same soldiers who'd scrambled in confusion across the western approach. These men moved like they'd been briefed on what went wrong the first time. She felt her pulse shift gear. "All stations," she said, her voice staying flat, even as everything inside her accelerated. "Second assault is initiating. Split element armored vehicles moving to the river delta approach infantry moving up the south face simultaneously." They adapted. "This is coordinated." Mercer came back immediately. "How many on the south face?" "Estimating 30 to 40. Moving in 3 sub-elements with space between them. They're staggered to prevent a single engagement scenario from stopping the whole advance." She tracked them through her scope, counting movement signatures. "Their commander learned from the first assault. He's spreading his force so I can't suppress the whole line." A pause on Mercer's end that lasted 2 seconds too long. Rachel heard what he didn't say in that silence. "Lieutenant," she said, "I need the machine gun on the south face firing on the lower element as soon as they hit the 300-meter line. That creates a forcing function. They either push through fire or they slow down. If they slow down, I can work the middle and upper elements. That exposes the machine gun position, Mercer said. Yes, Rachel said, but if those three sub-elements reach the ridge simultaneously, we can't stop all three. We have to break the timing of the assault. The machine gun is the only asset that can do that at that range. Another pause. Then, Ortega, you heard Sergeant Kane. Get the gun hot on the south face at 300 meters. Sergeant First Class Ortega's voice came back dry as sandpaper. Already moving, sir? Rachel swung her scope to the river delta. The armored vehicles were 2 minutes out from the base of the approach. She could see men on foot moving behind the vehicles using the armor as cover, advancing under the protection of steel and engine noise. She had approximately 90 seconds before the south face assault hit the 300-meter line and Ortega's gun opened up. 90 seconds before the noise level on this ridge went from quiet tension to full combat volume. She used those 90 seconds to do what she always did before things got loud. She got still. Not physically, she was already still. She got still inside. She let every thought that wasn't directly related to the next sequence of actions drain out of her mind. She stopped thinking about Eastern Europe. She stopped thinking about the faces she carried. She stopped thinking about what Mercer had said on the helicopter pad that she couldn't hold this position alone. She stopped thinking about all of it, and she became purely functional. The gun on the south face opened up. The sound cracked across the ridge like thunder splitting a granite rock, and instantly the world changed registers. No more whispered radio checks. No more careful quiet. The south face lit up with muzzle flash and tracer fire, and the sound of men shouting in a language Rachel didn't speak, but understood completely, because the tone of soldiers under fire is the same in every language and shock, then pain, then desperation, then rage. The lower enemy element on the south face took the machine gun fire full in the face at 300 meters and stopped moving forward, which was exactly what Rachel needed, because now the middle element was exposed. She fired. She worked through the middle element with the same cold geometric precision she'd used on the western face, but faster this time because the noise cover from Ortega's gun masked her muzzle signature and gave her something rare in a sniper engagement, the ability to fire at pace without revealing her exact position between shots. She dropped 6 men in the middle element in under 2 minutes. The middle element didn't break. They were better trained than the first assault group. They pushed into cover and started returning fire toward the ridgeline, not accurately, not even close to her actual position, but enough suppressive fire that she had to move. She moved. She snatched her rifle off the rest, rolled left, crawled 10 meters across frozen rock on her elbows and knees, set up behind a different outcrop, and was back behind her scope in under 45 seconds. It was during that 45-second movement that a mortar round landed on the ridge. Not close enough to hit her, close enough that the concussion knocked the air from her lungs, and she felt the heat of it on the side of her face even through the cold. She pressed flat against the rock, counted to 3, came back up. The mortar team was in the valley. She'd seen them set up but hadn't had an angle on them through the storm. Now they were dialed in on her general position. If she stayed in the same spot for more than 60 seconds, they'd walk the rounds onto her. She told Mercer immediately, "I've got a mortar team in the Valley South Quadrant. They have my rough position. I'm going to have to keep moving. Can you neutralize them?" "Not from here. I'd need to move to the southern ridge line to get an angle. But if I move to the southern ridge line, I lose observation on the river delta approach." "Can we get someone else on the delta?" Rachel thought about the 12 people in this platoon. "Who do you have that can call targets at that range?" Silence. "Nobody trained for it," Mercer admitted. "Then I stay here," Rachel said. "I keep moving. They'll keep mortaring and missing as long as I don't give them a fixed position." She heard Mercer take a breath. Rachel. It was the first time he'd used her first name. "I'm fine," she said. "Focus on the south face. How is Ortega?" "Gun is still up. Lower element is pinned, but the upper element went wide. They're trying to flank around the gun position." "I see them," Rachel said. She was already reorienting. "I have the upper element." She engaged. The next 12 minutes were the most sustained firefight she'd been in since Eastern Europe. Mortar rounds walked across the ridge every 90 seconds, each one close enough to shake the ground under her hands. The south face assault continued pressing through the machine gun fire, with the upper element trying to work around Ortega's flank. The river delta approach was only minutes away from bringing armored contact to the base of the ridge. And Rachel was moving constantly, firing from a new position, almost every minute, engaging the flanking element on the south face, tracking the Delta approach, calling corrections to Ortega, calling warnings to Mercer, and somewhere in the middle of all of it, she was bleeding from her forearm where the tape had come loose, and the cold air was doing nothing to help. Private Danny Okafor appeared at her position again. She heard him coming this time, not because he was loud, he'd gotten quieter since the shooting started, but because she'd trained herself to hear everything within 50 meters, even during combat noise. "Lieutenant sent me up with ammo," Danny said, keeping his body flat against the rock beside her. He slid 3 boxes of rifle ammunition toward her without her having to ask. Good, he was learning. "The Delta approach," Rachel said, without turning from her scope. "What's Mercer's plan for when the armor hits the base?" "He's got 2 AT-4s positioned on the ridge crest," Danny said. "Ortega's guys." 2 AT-4s against 3 armored vehicles, Rachel said. "Yeah, that's not enough." "I know," Danny said. "The lieutenant knows. He's hoping to disable the lead vehicle and create a choke point in the Delta that blocks the others." Rachel thought about this for a moment, watching the Delta through her scope, where the armored column was now clearly visible, even through the storm, moving steadily toward the base of the ridge. If Ortega's guys fire too early, they miss. If they fire too late, the vehicles are already at the base, and they have an elevation advantage over the AT-4 positions. "What's the right timing?" 200 meters, she said. "Tell Mercer fire when the lead vehicle hits 200 meters on the Delta approach. Any closer and the angle is wrong. Any farther and the round is fighting the wind." Danny keyed his radio and relayed the information word for word. Mercer came back 30 seconds later. "Confirmed, 200 meters on the Delta. Kane, I need you to keep eyes on that approach and call the range." "Copy." Danny started to pull back. Then he stopped. "Sergeant Kane." "Yeah." "Webb is scared," he said. "I mean, we're all scared. But Webb is, I don't know how to say it. He's kind of freezing up. He's not moving wrong. He's inside his own head," Rachel said. "Yeah." She kept her eyes on the scope. "Tell him this. Tell him the fear is the right reaction. Only the fear isn't the point. The point is what you do with the next 60 seconds. You don't have to survive the whole battle. You just have to get through the next 60 seconds. Then the 60 after that." She paused. "Tell him I said that." "I will," Danny said. "And Danny." "Yeah. Thank you for the ammo." He moved back down the ridge. She heard him go quiet and careful the way she'd told him, watching his own feet, controlling his own noise. He was learning faster than she'd expected. The mortar round that hit 30 seconds later landed 6 meters from her position. She felt it in her spine. Rock shrapnel cut across her left leg through the outer layer of her pants. Nothing deep, she checked by feel without looking away from the scope, but enough to burn. Enough to remind her that every minute she stayed in one place was a minute the mortar team used to calibrate. She moved again, and as she moved, she called the range on the Delta approach. Lead vehicle at 400 meters, moving at steady pace, no deviation. She set up her new position in 12 seconds and got eyes back on the valley. "Lead vehicle 350 meters, Ortega's voice came across the radio. "A T-4 teams are ready. 300 meters. She could feel the collective breath hold across the ridge. 12 soldiers, exhausted and cold and scared, and all pointing toward the valley, all waiting for the number that would start the next phase of the fight. 250 meters. She heard Marcus Webb's voice on the radio, barely a whisper directed at nobody in particular. 60 seconds. Just get through the next 60 seconds. She didn't know if he'd actually absorbed the message or if he was just repeating words to fill the silence in his own head. Either way, he was still at his position. He hadn't broken. 200 meters, Rachel said. The AT-4s fired. Both of them. Almost simultaneously. The sound they made was enormous, a sharp crack followed by a pressure wave that she felt in her sinuses, and she tracked the rounds downrange through her scope as two streaks of exhaust crossed the stormy dark toward the lead armored vehicle. One round was slightly off angle. It clipped the left track housing and detonated on the exterior armor, damaging but not decisive. The second round hit the engine compartment, dead center. The lead vehicle stopped moving. And stopped. Just stopped. Black smoke started immediately thick and heavy, rising visible against the snowstorm. The vehicle didn't burn dramatically. It just died 3 meters of smoking steel sitting sideways in the frozen river delta, blocking the entire width of the approach. The second and third armored vehicles behind it braked hard. They couldn't go around, the delta was too narrow. They couldn't go through, the wreck was blocking the choke point perfectly. The armored assault was stalled. For approximately 90 seconds, there was something close to relief across the ridge. Rachel heard it in the radio chatter, quick, sharp voices exchanging confirmation, somebody saying yes in a tone that came from the gut. And then the second armored vehicle opened up with its mounted gun. Not at the ridge, not at the AT-4 positions. At Rachel's overwatch. The rounds came across the valley in a straight line of tracer fire that looked almost beautiful in the dark before it started tearing chunks off the rock formation above her head. She was already flat before the first round hit. Rock dust, noise, the particular high sound of fast metal on stone very close to her head. She pressed her face into the ground and waited for the firing to break, while her mind worked the problem. The vehicle commander had identified her approximate position. He didn't have a precise fix. If he did, she'd already be dead, but he'd narrowed it down enough to put fire on the right section of ridgeline. The firing stopped. She had maybe 10 seconds before it started again, while the gunner reassessed. She moved in those 10 seconds. She moved faster than she'd moved all night, covering ground in a low crawl that burned through her injured leg and her cut forearm and demanded every physical reserve she had left. She got behind a new position just as the vehicle gun opened up again on where she'd been. Danny's voice came across her earpiece, urgent and tight. Kane report status. She was breathing hard, first time all night. I'm up, repositioned. The vehicle gun has my old position. We saw the fire. We thought, I'm up, she said again, steadier this time. Talk to me about the south face. What's the status on the flanking element? Ortega's gun stopped them, but he's reporting low on belts. Maybe 2 minutes of sustained fire before he has to go to single shots. 2 minutes. Rachel looked at the south face through her scope, found the flanking element that had been trying to work around Ortega's position. They'd gone to ground when the AT-4s fired, but they were already starting to move again. She counted them 9 men still disciplined, using the rocks while only 20 meters from a position that would give them a clear line on Ortega's gun from the flank. She had maybe 90 seconds before those 9 men reached that position. Ortega, she said, hold your fire. I've got the flanking element. You sure? Hold your fire. I need them to move. She settled in, controlled her breathing, let the flanking element start moving again, confident now that the machine gun had stopped. When they moved, she moved through them. 3 shots in 11 seconds, 3 men down. The remaining 6 scrambled for cover, confused because the shots had come from a direction they hadn't been watching. She changed her position again, and from the new angle, she had a view they hadn't anticipated. Ortega, she said, remaining 6 are pinned in the rock cluster at your 10 o'clock 20 meters out. They're not moving. If they try to push again, I'll see them. Copy that, Ortega said. Then after a brief pause, Kane, that's some serious shooting. She didn't respond to the compliment. She was already working the scope back to the south face main body, checking where the first and second sub-elements had gone to ground. The machine gun fire had stalled them. Her engagement of the flanking element had created a temporary crisis in their command structure. She could see it in the way movement had stopped simultaneously across all 3 sub-elements. When your flanking unit disappears without warning, you stop and reassess. It's instinct. It's training. It's also predictable. She used the pause to do something she hadn't done in 90 minutes. She checked her ammunition. The number was not comfortable. She had enough. She had enough for what was currently in front of her. But the assault wasn't over. The infantry on the south face would push again. The stalled armor in the delta would eventually find another solution. And the valley still held unknown numbers that hadn't committed yet. She thought about Mercer's words on the helicopter pad. You can't hold that position alone. She thought about them not as doubt, but as a problem to solve. He wasn't wrong about the math. He was wrong about what the math meant for what she was going to do. She keyed her radio. Lieutenant, give me a full status on the platoon. I need to know what I'm working with. Mercer ran through it. 4 soldiers on the south face defensive line with Ortega. 2 communications specialists holding the radar station itself. Danny Okafor running as runner between positions. Marcus Webb on the eastern approach with 2 others. 2 soldiers down, 1 with a leg wound, 1 with a concussion from a near mortar hit. 10 effectives remaining. 12 if you counted the ones who were walking wounded and refusing to stop. 12 soldiers on a ridge with 3 assault elements pressing from different directions, limited ammunition, no air support, in 40-some hours until reinforcement. Kane, Mercer said when he finished the rundown, "Tell me honestly, can we hold this?" She thought about the answer for exactly 1 second. "We held the first assault," she said. "We stalled the second. Yes, we can hold this." "I need more than tactical confidence right now," Mercer said, and she could hear in his voice that he was asking something deeper than a tactical question. He was asking the way a person asks when they're looking for a reason to believe in something. Rachel understood that. She'd been looking for a reason herself every night for 3 years. "Listen to mate," she said. "Every person on this ridge is still fighting. Nobody broke. That matters more than the math right now." She paused. "Hold your position, conserve your ammunition, and trust the next 60 seconds. A long silence on the radio. Then Mercer said, "Copy that." She turned back to her GoPro. The south face was starting to move again. And somewhere in the valley below, she could see fresh signal lights appearing at the far eastern edge. New movement, a third element she hadn't seen before, positioning itself for what came next. She cataloged it. She planned against it. She started building the sequence in her mind for how she would handle the next assault when it came. Because it was coming, and she would not leave this ridge. She had made that decision long before the first shot was fired. The moment the radio had crackled with the enemy commander's order. Leave no one alive. She had made it without drama, without ceremony, without telling anyone. She would not leave. Not these soldiers. Not these boys who'd never been in real combat. Not the wounded men in the medical bunker below who couldn't run if the ridge fell. Not this time. The wind shifted direction. The snow came harder. And Staff Sergeant Rachel Kane settled deeper into her position, controlled her breathing, and waited for the next wave to climb toward her. The third element hit at 01:47 hours. Rachel had been tracking their approach for 22 minutes before they moved. She'd watched them assemble it at the eastern edge of the valley with a discipline the first 2 assault groups hadn't shown. No signal lights, minimal radio traffic. Movement patterns tight and deliberate. These weren't the same quality of fighters as the men who'd climbed the western and southern faces. These were different, better trained, better equipped, moving like people who had done this before and won. She told Mercer immediately, "Third element is moving, eastern approach. I count at least 40, possibly more, behind the storm line I can't penetrate. They have thermal drones. I can see the operator signatures. And Lieutenant," she paused, making sure she had the words right before she said them, "they have flamethrower units in the lead, at least 4 confirmed." The silence that followed lasted 3 full seconds. "Flamethrowers," Mercer repeated. "Yes." Another pause. When Mercer spoke again, his voice had dropped to something very quiet and very controlled, the way voices get when a person is working hard to keep fear from becoming the loudest thing in the room. "Kane, our defensive line on the eastern approach is Webb and 2 others. They have 1 saw and personal weapons." "I know," Rachel said. "That's not enough to stop flamethrower units." "I know that too," she said, "which is why I need you to pull Webb and his team back 30 meters to the secondary position behind the rock shelf, right now before the element reaches the 400-meter line. If we pull back from the primary position, if we don't pull back, Webb and his team get burned alive in an open position with no cover," Rachel said, and she said it plainly without softening it, because Mercer needed the actual picture right now, not a diplomatic version of it. "The secondary position gives them overhead rock cover. The flamethrowers lose effectiveness at range. Pull them back, and I will handle the forward element. You'll handle 40 men with flamethrowers. I'll handle enough of them to buy time," she said. "Pull Webb back. Now." Mercer gave the order. She heard Webb's voice come across the radio a moment later, confused and young and trying very hard not to sound either of those things. "We're pulling back. We're giving up the position," Ortega answered before Rachel could. "We're not giving up anything. We're making them come to us through a kill zone. There's a difference. Move." Webb moved. Rachel was already repositioning herself along the eastern ridgeline, moving to a point that gave her the widest possible field of fire on the approach corridor. Her leg was burning from the shrapnel hit she'd taken an hour ago. Her forearm had stopped bleeding, but the muscle underneath felt thick and wrong when she flexed it. Her shoulder, the one she'd been favoring since the second mortar hit, sent a rock fragment into it, was making itself known in a way that she was cataloging and setting aside the way you set aside a bill. You know you'll eventually have to pay. She set up her position in the dark without a light. She didn't need one. She'd been in the dark long enough that her eyes had found everything there was to find, and the rest she did by memory and touch. "Danny," she said into the radio. "Right here," Danny answered. He was getting faster. 3 hours ago, he'd taken 5 seconds to respond. Now it was 1. "I need you to go to the medical bunker and tell the senior medic to move the critical patients to the rear wall, the eastern wall specifically. If the flamethrower element reaches the ridge crest before I stop them, fire will come from the east. The rear wall is the only hard cover they have." A pause. "You think they might get through?" "I think I need the wounded soldiers to be in the safest possible position, regardless of what happens," Rachel said. "Go." He went. She settled into her rifle. The thermal drones were the problem. She'd identified 3 of them weaving above the eastern approach, scanning the ridge for heat signatures. Every time she repositioned, she was painting herself on their screens. The drone operators would be feeding that information directly to the assault element's commander, telling him where the American defenders were, where the gaps were, where the fire was coming from. She needed to take the drones down first. The problem was drones, moving targets, small profile, in a snowstorm. She had exactly enough ammunition to be wrong about this twice. She didn't intend to be wrong. She tracked the nearest drone for 40 seconds, reading its flight pattern, mapping the repetition in it. Drones flown by operators under stress tended to develop rhythmic search patterns back and forth, a habit of the nervous system translating through the controls. She found the rhythm. She calculated where the drone would be in 3 seconds based on where it was now. She fired. The drone dropped. Not a clean hit on the first shot. She'd clipped the rotor assembly, and it went into an uncontrolled spiral before hitting the slope. But down was down. She was already tracking the second. The second drone broke pattern the moment the first went down. The operator had seen it and was responding, pulling the drone into an erratic, evasive flight. She tracked it for 20 seconds, waiting for the operator's panic to settle into a new pattern. It did. Operators always settled. The human nervous system wants order even when order is dangerous. She fired. Second drone down, clean. The third drone went high immediately. The operator had pulled it up out of her range before she could acquire it. Smart. She let it go. 2 out of 3 still shifted the enemy's observation capability enough to matter. "Kane," Mercer said, "I've got 2 drone signatures down on my display. Are those yours?" "2 of 3, she said. "The third is high and out of range. They still have observation capability, but it's reduced." How did you even?" Mercer stopped himself. "Good work. The element is at 300 meters. She knew. She could see them. And now with the drones disrupted, she could also see something she'd been trying to confirm since the element first appeared at the valley edge. The assault formation had a structure she recognized from the joint force training she'd done before Eastern Europe, a specific way of organizing a combined flamethrower and infantry advance that she'd only seen used by one particular type of unit. These weren't mercenaries. These were trained special operations soldiers wearing mercenary kit. She considered whether to tell Mercer this, decided he needed to know, and told him in 4 words, "Third element is special forces." The radio went quiet for a moment in the way that radios go quiet when everyone on the net hears something and nobody is quite sure what to do with it. Then Ortega's voice, flat as asphalt, "Of course they are." "It changes the engagement profile," Rachel said. "They won't break contact the way the first 2 groups did. Even under fire, they'll push. They're trained to absorb casualties and continue the objective. I need everyone to understand if any of them reach the ridge, they will fight for every meter." "What do you need?" Mercer asked. "I need 2 minutes of suppressive fire from every position on the eastern defensive line the moment they hit 200 meters. Not aimed fire. I need noise and muzzle flash to break their thermal observation. It creates confusion in the drone feed and disrupts their command coordination. While that's happening, I will work the flamethrower operators. Without the flamethrowers, they lose their primary breach tool. You want us to create a distraction so you can take out the flamethrower teams?" "Yes." "While you're already being tracked by their third drone?" "Yes." Mercer's voice dropped to something very low. "Rachel, I need you to tell me you're okay up there." It was the second time he'd used her first name. She thought about what okay meant, standing on a frozen ridge at 0152 hours with blood in her boot and 3 assault elements behind her and 40 special operations soldiers about to climb toward her with fire. "I'm functional," she said. "That's what matters right now." A beat. Then, all stations on Sergeant Kane's marked 2 minutes suppressive fire eastern approach. "Webb you included. Everything you have." Webb's voice came back thin but present. "Copy." She watched the element close the distance. 250, 225. She identified the 4 flamethrower operators. They were positioned at specific intervals in the formation, protected by 2-man security teams flanking each one. Taking them out wasn't going to be simple. The security teams would react fast. She was going to have to sequence the shots in an order that gave her the maximum time before the security teams could respond. She built the sequence in her head. 3rd flamethrower operator, first positioned at the edge of the formation, least covered. Then first, then second. The 4th was behind a natural rock feature that gave him cover from her current angle. She'd need to shift position to get the 4th, which meant she'd be moving between shots 4 and 5 while the security teams were already reacting. This was going to be very fast and very close to not working. 200 meters. "Mark," she said. The ridge erupted. Every American weapon on the eastern face opened simultaneously, the SAW personal rifles. Everything, and the noise was enormous. A wall of sound and muzzle flash that hit the advancing element like a physical thing. Not accurate, not intended to be. Intended to blind, to overwhelm, to break the rhythm of the advance and the clarity of the drone feed for exactly 2 minutes. Rachel fired into the chaos. 3rd flamethrower operator down. Shift right. Breathe. 1st operator down. The security teams were moving. She could see them reacting, trying to locate the source of the shots, but the suppressive fire from the ridge was everywhere, and the drone above was struggling to separate her heat signature from the general noise of a dozen weapons firing. 2nd operator down. She moved. Hard and fast, 15 meters left along the ridge, knees screaming, shoulders screaming, doing it anyway because stopping was worse than moving. She got behind the new position. Found the 4th flamethrower operator through the scope. The man had gone prone and was crawling toward better cover. Smart. She tracked him. Waited for the crawl to pause. People always pause for a half second when they think they've reached safety, and fired when he stopped. 4 flamethrower operators. All down. "Ceasefire," she said into the radio. "Ceasefire on the eastern approach." The American guns stopped. For one strange second, the ridge was almost quiet, just the wind and the ringing in everyone's ears. Then the special operations element did exactly what she'd said they would do. They didn't break. They kept coming. She heard Mercer's voice, tight and controlled. "They're still moving. Kane, they are still moving." "I know," she said. She was already working through the formation, targeting the element's command structure officers first, then NCOs, the people whose decisions kept the unit moving when everything else was chaos. It was a brutal calculation. It was the only calculation that had any chance of working against this quality of opponent. She took out what she assessed as the element commander, the man at the rear of the formation whose radio traffic and command gestures identified him, and watched the formation hesitate for the first time. Not stop, hesitate. 8 seconds of hesitation. She used all 8 of them. The formation's momentum broke. Not completely, these were too well trained for a complete collapse. But the hesitation created gaps in their spacing, and gaps in spacing against a sniper is the difference between a disciplined advance and a confused one. She worked the gaps. The element slowed. 30 meters from the ridge base, it stopped. Not retreated. Stopped and reorganized, going to ground, establishing a base of fire position, while the surviving command element tried to re-establish control of the assault. "They're pinned at the base," Rachel reported, 100 meters below the ridge. "They're reorganizing. I estimate 8 to 12 minutes before they push again." The ridge was quiet enough for a moment that she could hear her own breathing. Ortega's voice came across, and he sounded like a man who had just watched something he didn't have words for. "Kane, how many rounds did you just fire in the last 3 minutes?" She checked her count instinctively. 14. 14 rounds, Ortega repeated, in 3 minutes, against 40 Special Forces soldiers. And they stopped. "They didn't stop," she said. "They reorganized. There's a difference. We have 8 minutes. Right, Ortega said. 8 minutes. A pause. I'm going to take those 8 minutes to think about career choices. Despite everything, she almost laughed. Then Danny's voice came across, and it had a different quality, tighter, higher, the specific pitch of someone delivering news they don't want to deliver. Sergeant Kane, I'm at the medical bunker. The senior medic wants to talk to you. A beat. Put him on. A new voice came across, older, steady, but carrying the weight of someone who'd been watching people bleed for the last 3 hours. Sergeant Kane, this is Staff Sergeant Prentice. I have 7 patients. 2 are critical. They will not survive being moved under fire. I need you to understand what happens to these men if that ridge crest is breached. She already understood. She'd understood it before he said it. But she let him finish because he needed to say it, and she owed him the courtesy of hearing it. I understand, she said. I don't think you do, Prentice said, not unkindly. I'm not talking about tactics. I'm telling you that I have 2 men in here who are alive because of everything you've done in the last 3 hours. 2 men who will not be alive if you stop doing it. The weight of that settled into her chest alongside everything else she was already carrying. I hear you, she said. Good, Prentice said, because I've been a medic for 17 years and I have never not once put everything on one person like this. And I am putting everything on you right now. Everything. She closed her eyes for 1 second. 1 full second where she let herself feel the size of what he'd just said. The weight of 7 patients. The weight of 12 soldiers on the ridge. The weight of everything riding on a single rifle in a blizzard on a mountain in Alaska. Then she opened her eyes. Tell your patients to hold on, she said. Tell them the ridge isn't falling tonight. She clicked off and went back to her scope. 6 minutes left before the special operations element pushed again. She used 3 of them to do a full ammunition check, an equipment check on her rifle she'd been firing hard enough that the barrel was building heat she needed to account for, and a physical inventory of her own body, noting each injury, the way you'd note damage to equipment clinically without drama, just gathering information about what she had available. Left leg functional painful, slowing her repositioning by 2 to 3 seconds per move. Acceptable. Left forearm manageable. The muscle limitation was reducing her support hand stability. She'd compensated by adjusting her rest position. Acceptable. Right shoulder, the worst of the 3. The fragment that had caught her during the second assault had gone in at an angle she didn't like, and the last 90 minutes of hard movement had made it worse. She had full use of her arm, but the pain was at a level that required active management, meaning part of her brain that could be used for targeting was being used for pain suppression instead. Not acceptable, but unavoidable. She reported none of this to Mercer. There was nothing he could do about it, and the information would only generate concern that would slow the decision-making she needed from him to be fast and clean. She keyed her radio instead. Mercer, status on ammunition across all positions. Mercer ran through it. The numbers were not comfortable, but they weren't catastrophic yet. Ortega's machine gun was the critical constraint, low on belts down to the last reserves. Webb's team was better off, but not by much. Rachel's own supply was the tightest of all because she'd been firing more than anyone. We need to make every shot count from here, she said. Suppressive fire only if I call it. Single aim shots otherwise. Do not waste rounds on targets I can engage from Overwatch. Copy, Mercer said. And Lieutenant, yeah. The 3rd drone is still up there. When the element pushes again, they're going to use it to call my position to a secondary mortar team. I saw them repositioning in the valley 15 minutes ago. When the assault resumes, I'm going to have mortars and an assault element simultaneously. I need you to know that ahead of time. Mercer was quiet for a moment. What do you need? Nothing you can give me, she said honestly. I just need you to know so that if my radio goes quiet, you understand what happened and you don't wait for orders from me that aren't coming. Ortega takes over the Overwatch coordination. Rachel, I'm not being fatalistic, she said, cutting him off gently. I'm being a professional. If I go down, Ortega needs to know he's the one. That's just planning. A long pause. Then Ortega, you heard that. Ortega's voice came back careful and flat. I heard it. And for the record, Kane, I plan on not needing that information. Me too, she said. The 8 minutes ended at 02:14 hours. The special operations element pushed again. This time they came differently. They split a deliberate train split into 2 parallel columns using the natural rock features on either side of the eastern approach. each column covering the other's movement, leapfrogging forward in a pattern designed to prevent a single shooter from engaging both simultaneously. She'd never seen it executed in live combat before. She trained against it in simulation. She knew the counter to it theoretically. Executing the counter alone at night, wounded with limited ammunition against soldiers who were doing it correctly, that was a different conversation entirely. She made the decision in 3 seconds. She couldn't stop both columns simultaneously, so she wouldn't try. She would collapse one column fast enough that the surviving elements of that column broke the timing of the other, and then she would pivot. She chose the left column. She went into it hard and fast, firing at a pace she'd never sustained in live engagement. Not reckless, but at the absolute edge of her trained accuracy threshold, the point where the mechanical precision of her technique was the only thing standing between effective fire and wasted ammunition. Left column, 5 shots in 16 seconds, 4 confirmed down, 1 probable. The left column broke contact. The right column, seeing the left go down, hesitated not long seconds, but enough, and in that hesitation, Rachel pivoted and put 3 rounds into the right column's lead element. The right column stopped advancing, and then the mortar hit. It landed 4 meters to her right. The concussion threw her physically not far less than a meter, but enough that her rifle came off the rest and her scope hit the rock, and she felt something in her shoulder tear in a way that was loud and white and total. She was face down for 2 seconds, 2 full seconds, where she was aware of nothing except the ringing and the white and the cold of the rock under her cheek. Then she heard Danny's voice in her earpiece, raw with fear. "Kane, Kane, answer me, Kane." She got her hands under her. She pushed up. Her right shoulder didn't cooperate the way it should have, and she used the rock to lever herself up, instead dragging herself back behind her rifle. "I'm up," she said. "You went quiet for we saw the mortar. We thought." "I'm up," she said a third time, because that was all that mattered, and she didn't have the air or the focus for more words than that. She got her eye back to the scope. Her right shoulder was wrong. Seriously wrong now. Not the manageable wrong from before, but the kind of wrong that sends clear signals to every part of the nervous system simultaneously. She could still hold the rifle. Her grip was compromised. Her stability was reduced. She compensated by changing her support, entirely shifting the rifle weight to her left side, shooting in a way she hadn't practiced since a training exercise years ago that her instructor had called the emergency position. She fired the emergency position. She fired it accurately. The right column, which had started advancing again during the 2 seconds she'd been down, lost 2 more men and went to ground for the second time. "Mortar team in the valley," Mercer said. "They're going to fire again." "I know," Rachel said. "I need to move. Talk to me about the columns." "Left column is regrouping at the base. Right column is pinned. But Kane, I've got a 4th element appearing on my eastern sensor, coming from the far ridge, not the valley. They're coming down from above." She went still. From above. She looked up instinctively, even though instinct was useless in the dark and the storm. A 4th element coming from the high ground above her position meant they'd been inserted separately, repelled, or walked in from a completely different approach, probably hours ago before the battle even started. Positioned to come down from above when the frontal assault had pinned the American defenders. It was the move she would have made. She felt something she did not feel often. Not fear, but a particular clarity that only arrives when the problem gets bad enough that the only way out is through. "How many?" she asked. "Sensor shows 8, maybe 10 signatures. Moving fast. They're 10 minutes out from your position." 10 minutes. A frontal assault below her reorganizing. A mortar team in the valley ranging in. An element coming from above. And a ridge full of wounded soldiers and exhausted fighters with not enough ammunition behind her. She made the calculation. She made it in the space of a single breath. "Mercer," she said, "I'm leaving the overwatch position." Silence on the radio. "I'm going up," she said. "I'm going to the high ground above my current position. If I stay here, the element coming from above pins me from the high ground, and the frontal assault uses the distraction to push through. If I move up, I take the high ground from them before they reach it, and I maintain the angle on both threats. Kane, that position is completely exposed. There's no cover above the current overwatch. There's rock at the summit shelf," she said. "I've been looking at it all night. It's exposed on the approach, but the shelf itself has a lip. I can work from behind the lip." The mortar team will have a clear line on you the moment you move. Yes, she said. Another silence. If I stay here, she said quietly, the element from above pins me and the frontal assault breaks through. That's not a tactical assessment. That's math. She paused. I'm going up. She heard Mercer exhale, long, controlled. Ortega, Mercer said, cover the eastern approach. Web shift north, fill Kane's former position. Everyone else hold tight. He paused. Rachel, be fast. She was already moving. She went up the ridge in the dark with a torn shoulder and a bleeding leg, and everything she had left in her physical body climbing rocks she'd never touched before, navigating by touch and by the map she'd been building in her head since the moment she'd stepped off the helicopter. 40 meters, 30, 20. The mortar team in the valley found her movement signature on the drone feed and fired. The round hit the slope below her. She kept climbing. Another round, closer. She reached the summit shelf at 0231 hours, threw herself behind the rock lip, and came up with her rifle. Below her, the element from above was 15 meters closer than Mercer's estimate. 8 men moving in a tight column 40 seconds from her position. Below that, the frontal assault was pushing again. Below that, in the medical bunker, 2 critical patients were alive because of everything she'd done tonight. She settled her rifle on the lip of the rock. Her shoulder was screaming at a volume she could no longer manage down to background noise. She heard it, she cataloged it. She set it aside one more time. She breathed, and she started working. She took the first man from the high element at 30 meters. The shot was fast and close, and not the kind of distance she preferred, but the summit shelf gave her 3 feet of rock. Lip between her body and the approaching column, and she used every inch of it. The man dropped without sound. The second man in the column saw him go and reacted faster than mercenaries reacted, faster than conscripted soldiers reacted, and went sideways into cover before Rachel could cycle the bolt. Special operations instinct. Immediate and trained. He didn't freeze. He moved. She noted it and recalculated. 7 men remaining in the high element. All of them now going to cover simultaneously, spreading laterally across the upper slope, using the darkness and the storm and the rock to disappear. In 10 seconds, they'd gone from a column she could work through sequentially to 8 individual problems scattered across 40 meters of terrain. Her radio crackled. Mercer's voice tight. Kane, report. High element is in cover, she said. 7 remaining. They're spreading. I need 60 seconds. You don't have 60 seconds. Frontal assault just pushed again. They're at the base of the ridge. Ortega's gun is down to the last belt. She processed this without letting it change her breathing. How long on Ortega's last belt? He says 90 seconds of sustained fire. Maybe 2 minutes if he's careful. 90 seconds. 2 minutes. Numbers that felt enormous in planning and microscopic in actual combat. Tell Ortega to hold the belt, she said. Don't fire yet. I need the frontal assault to commit to the approach before he opens up. If he fires now, they go to ground, and we're back to a stalemate. He's not going to love that. Tell him anyway. She heard Mercer relay the order, heard Ortega's response, which contained one word she wouldn't repeat, and then a clipped copy. She turned back to the high element. The storm was working against her now. The wind had shifted again, pushing snow horizontally across the summit shelf, and the thermal signature of the men above her was breaking up in the drone feed she couldn't see, but could infer from the way the mortar fire had stopped. When the drone lost clean targeting data, the mortar team went quiet. They'd fire again the moment they had her position confirmed. She used the quiet. She found the first man by sound, not sight. He'd moved to a rock formation 8 meters to her left, and she heard the specific sound of a boot sole scraping ice. A small sound, a careful sound, the sound of someone who believed they were being quiet and almost was. She adjusted 4 inches left and waited for the next sound. He gave it to her in 11 seconds. She fired, 6 remaining. The response was immediate. 2 of them opened up on her position, not blind suppressive fire, but aimed disciplined, bracketing her behind the rock lip. These men knew exactly what they were doing. The rounds came in pairs, walking across the lip, forcing her to keep her head down. She was pinned for the first time all night. Not for long, 20 seconds. But 20 seconds with the frontal assault climbing the ridge below, and Ortega's gun on its last belt, and 6 Special Forces soldiers above her trying to flank the lip 20 seconds was a very expensive thing to spend. She made a decision that her training instructor would have called tactically unsound, and that 3 years of surviving impossible things had taught her was sometimes the only move left. She came up over the lip, not behind cover, over it, exposed, full upper body above the rock for 4 seconds, while she identified 2 of the 6 remaining positions and fired once at each. She dropped back behind the lip before the return fire found her. 1 confirmed, 1 probable. Her shoulder had made a sound when she came up that she didn't want to think about. She thought about it anyway clinically the way she'd been managing it all night. The tear from the mortar blast earlier had expanded. She could feel the joint moving in a way joints were not supposed to move. She still had the arm. The arm still worked. The grip was degraded further, and the stability was significantly worse, and the pain was at a level that required a different kind of management than setting it aside. Now she had to actively work around it, compensating with her whole body. She compensated. Kane. Danny's voice, and it had a quality she hadn't heard from him yet tonight. Not fear, which she'd heard plenty of, but something past fear on the other side of it, where a person has been afraid so long and so hard that they've burned through it and come out somewhere quieter. Kane, I'm at the base of the summit shelf. I brought what's left of the platoon's rifle ammunition. She absorbed this. Danny, I told you to stay with the medical bunker. Prentice has Webb now. I counted what you had left. You needed resupply. She wanted to tell him to go back. She ran the math on her remaining ammunition and stopped wanting to tell him that. How did you get up here without the high element seeing you? I came up the west side of the shelf. There's a blind approach. You can't see it from above. She filed that information immediately. A blind approach from the west that the high element didn't know about. Danny, listen to me carefully. I need you to go back down that west approach and tell Ortega about it. If the high element flanks around the summit shelf, they'll find it and use it to come down behind the ridge. Ortega needs to know to cover it. A pause. I can cover it from here. Danny, I have a rifle, he said, and his voice was steady in a way it hadn't been at the start of the night. I qualified expert. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you I'm covering the west approach. She would talk to him about command structure later. Right now she needed the west approach covered, and he was the only asset she had. Stay low. Do not engage unless they are physically on the approach. The moment you fire, you become a target. Understood. Understood. And Danny, damn. Yeah. Thank you. She heard him move into position. Then she turned back to the summit shelf problem. 4 remaining in the high element, possibly 5. The 2 she'd engaged when she came over the lip had gone quiet, and she couldn't confirm both. The remaining element was patient in a way that told her they'd shifted from assault mode to containment. They were holding her on the summit shelf while they waited for the frontal assault to breach the ridge below and come up from underneath. Pincer. A classic pincer. She understood it. She even admired the execution. And she had to break it in the next 4 minutes or it would close. Mercer, she said, frontal assault status. They're at 50 meters below the ridge crest, moving carefully. They've been taking fire from Webb's position, but Webb is almost out. Webb. She switched channels. Webb, this is Kane. How are you doing? A pause. Then Marcus Webb's voice, 19 years old, somewhere between terrified and something he'd never had a name for before tonight. I'm okay. I'm okay, Sergeant Kane. You've been holding that position for 3 hours, she said. Yes, Sergeant. You know what that means? No, Sergeant. It means you already did the hard part, she said. Everything from here is just finishing what you already started. You hear me? A longer pause. She heard him breathe. I hear you. How many rounds do you have left? 22. Make them count. Single shots aimed, no suppressive fire. Pick the most dangerous target in your sector and fire when you're sure. Copy, Webb said, and something in his voice had settled. She clicked back to Mercer's channel. Here's what I need, she said. In 90 seconds, tell Ortega to open up with everything on the last belt. Full rate of fire straight into the frontal hole. Assault. I know it'll burn the belt fast. I need the assault to stop moving for 45 seconds while Ortega fires. That's all. 45 seconds. What do you do in 45 seconds? I clear the high element and get back to Overwatch. The radio was quiet long enough that she counted 3 seconds. Rachel. Mercer said, and the way he said it carried something she hadn't heard from him before. Not command authority, not tactical assessment. Something more human than either of those things. Tell me you can do this. She thought about Eastern Europe, about 5 men who stayed behind, about the decision she'd made and the 3 years she'd spent carrying it, about Prentice's voice saying, I am putting everything on you right now. Yes, she said, I can do this. 90 seconds, Mercer said. Go. She moved. She came up off the lip in a direction the high element wasn't covering. She'd spent the last 4 minutes mapping their fire positions, and she knew the angle they weren't watching because it was the angle they'd assume was dead ground from the summit shelf geometry. It was dead ground. She was using it anyway. She came around the left side of the shelf at a low crawl, moving through the cold and the wind with her shoulder screaming and her leg burning, and all of it somewhere below the threshold of what she was paying attention to, because what she was paying attention to was the 4 men above her and the 45 seconds she was going to get when Ortega's gun opened up. She found the first man by the glow of his thermal optic. He was watching the ridge below, waiting for the breach, not watching the dead ground to his left, because why would he know but he came from dead ground? She was 6 meters away when she fired. The sound of Ortega's gun opening up on the ridge below happened simultaneously, and the combination of the 2 sounds in rapid succession created a moment of complete auditory confusion for the remaining 3 high-element soldiers. They didn't know which direction the threat was coming from. For 2 seconds, they were making decisions with incomplete information. She gave them another incomplete piece. She moved again 10 meters right and fired at the second man while he was still orienting toward where the first shot had come from. 2 down, 2 remaining. The last 2 were better. They'd processed faster, taken cover, and were now watching multiple directions simultaneously. She heard them communicating in short-clipped radio calls she couldn't understand, but didn't need to. The urgency in the voices told her everything. They were calling the situation to their command. They were asking for instructions. She had maybe 30 seconds before those instructions came back and the situation changed again. She moved toward them instead of away. It was the last thing trained soldiers expected from a single defender, to close the distance rather than maintain it. The psychology of the sniper was distance, precision, space. Closing to close quarters was a different weapon system entirely, and she was betting everything that the 2 remaining men were processing the tactical situation through the lens of countering a sniper, not countering a soldier who decided to fight differently. She came around a rock at 4 meters. The man saw her. He was fast, genuinely fast, military fast, and he got his weapon up, and she was already firing, and the shot that came from his direction passed close enough that she felt the air pressure of it before she was behind rock again. 1 down. Her heart was running so hard she could feel it in her throat. Not from fear, from exertion and blood loss and the specific physical cost of 4 hours of sustained combat with 3 injuries that should have taken her off the field 2 hours ago. The last man, she could hear him moving. He wasn't running. He was repositioning tactically, trying to establish a new angle. Smart, patient. The best soldier in the high element, she'd now confirmed, because the best ones were always last. She forced herself to breathe, to slow down inside even as everything outside was going full speed, to think about angles and movement in the specific geometry of the summit shelf that she'd been studying since she climbed it. He was going to the west side, the west approach. Danny. She keyed her to radio voice low and fast. Danny, he's coming to you. 1 man, coming from the east. Do not let him reach the approach. A pause that lasted 1 breath. Then Danny Okafor, who had never fired in live combat before tonight, who had spent the first hour of this battle checking his sector every 5 minutes because he couldn't decide what he was most scared of, said, I see him. 1 shot from the west approach. Silence. Danny, boom, Rachel said, report. Another pause. Longer this time. He's down, Danny said, and his voice was a strange mixture of sounds. The tightness of someone who had just done something irrevocable and the flatness of someone who understood why they had had to do it. He's down, Sergeant Kane. You okay? Yeah, I'm okay. She believed him, and she didn't simultaneously the way you believe anyone who says they're okay after the first time. She would talk to him properly later. Right now, there was no later, there was only now. Stay on the approach, she said. Don't move. She was already moving back to the summit shelf edge, getting her rifle back on the ridge below, finding the frontal assault through her scope. Ortega's gun had burned through the last belt 60 seconds ago, and the assault had used the silence to push hard. They were at the ridge crest. Now the lead elements physically on the ridge itself, fighting through the last of the American defensive positions. She heard Reyes on the radio. "They're on the ridge. Multiple hostiles on the ridge, east section. We're in close contact." She heard Webb, "I'm out. I'm out of ammunition." She heard Mercer, "Fall back to secondary. Everyone to the secondary position." She heard Prentice from the medical bunker, saying nothing, but she could hear his breathing on the open channel. The breathing of a man who had done everything he could and was now waiting to find out if it was enough. She fired into the lead element on the ridge. 3 shots. 3 down. The lead element stopped pushing and went to cover. It bought 10 seconds. Enough for Reyes to pull 2 wounded soldiers back from the forward position. Enough for Webb to drag himself to the secondary line with an empty rifle and pick up a sidearm from a fallen soldier on the way. Enough. She fired again, then again. Working through the assault element on the ridge with everything she had left, every round calculated, no wasted shots. Every trigger pull preceded by the same sequence she'd been running since the first shot on the western face. 6 hours ago, find the target, it read the wind control. The breath fire. The assault stalled on the ridge. Not retreated. Stalled. Pressed to cover, unable to advance because every time a man moved, Rachel Kane shot him from the summit shelf above. She heard the enemy radio traffic change in character, still unintelligible in language. But the tone shifted from coordinated assault to something closer to defensive. They were requesting guidance. They were asking their command what to do about the sniper on the high ground, who was still firing after 6 hours and 4 assault waves and more incoming fire than any single person should have absorbed. And then she heard it across the open frequency in accented but clear English, which told her the enemy commander wanted his men to understand the order without translation delay. "Find the woman on the ridge. Take her alive." She heard those 5 words and felt something move through her that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite anger. It was something older and cleaner than either the specific clarity of a person who has been fighting alone long enough that the enemy wanting them alive means they're doing exactly the right thing. She keyed her radio. "Mercer, they just ordered their men to take me alive." A pause. "Is that good or bad?" "It means they've decided I'm worth more as a capture than a kill," she said, "which means they're more afraid of what I'm doing than they are of what I might tell them." She paused. "It also means the next phase of their assault is going to prioritize capture over direct fire. They'll try to maneuver around me rather than shoot through me, which changes your threat profile significantly. What do you need?" She looked at her ammunition. The number she saw was the number she'd been managing toward for the last hour, the place where every remaining round had to count for something specific because there were no more rounds after these. "I need you to know that I have a limited number of shots remaining," she said. "I am not going to tell you the number because I need you focused on your defensive line and not on managing the information. What I need from you is to hold a secondary position and trust that I will make every round matter." Mercer was quiet for a moment. "How limited?" "Limited enough that I'm telling you," she said. Another silence. When Mercer spoke again, something in his voice had changed in a way she couldn't fully name. It was the voice of a man who had started the night believing certain things about what people could do and was ending it, having revised every one of them. "Tell me what you need and I will find it." "You can't give me what I need from down there," she said. "Just hold the line." She turned back to the ridge. The assault element was maneuvering. She could see it, 2 groups splitting, one trying to work north along the ridge, one trying to push south, both movements designed to bracket her summit shelf position from 2 angles simultaneously. If both groups reached their target positions, she'd have no angle that wasn't covered. She had to stop one of them before they reached position. She chose the northern group. 7 men moving fast and disciplined, using the rocks well, but moving faster than was tactically optimal, which told her they had a time constraint she didn't fully understand yet. She worked through the northern group in 40 seconds. 3 confirmed down. The remaining 4 stopped and went to cover so quickly that she knew she'd hit their limit. They'd been taking losses all night from this position, and the cumulative attrition of fighting a single shooter who would not go down was doing something to their morale that tactics alone couldn't fix. She heard one of them say something over their radio. She didn't understand the language, But she understood the tone. It was the tone of a soldier who is asking a question that starts with the word why. Why is this person still fighting? Why are we still losing? Why hasn't she stopped? She filed it and turned to the Southern group. The Southern group had used her 40 seconds on the Northern group to advance further than she'd expected. They were close, too close, 30 meters from a position that would give them the angle on her shelf. She had to move. She pulled back from the lip, moved 10 meters across the shelf, shoulder, leg, arm, all registering at maximum volume, and set up behind the only other viable feature the shelf offered. It was worse cover, shallower, less protection on the right side, but it gave her the angle on the Southern group's approach. She fired. 2 down. The group scattered, but one of them had gotten far enough around the Southern edge that he had a partial angle on her new position, and the shot that came from that angle hit the rock 6 inches from her right hand. 6 inches. She felt the rock fragments on her knuckles. She kept her hands on the rifle. She fired at the angle. The firing from that direction stopped. She was breathing hard again. Second time tonight, she registered it the way she registered her injuries information, not crisis. Her radio, Danny's voice. Sergeant Kane, I've got movement below the west approach. 3 men moving up. She closed her eyes for 1 second. A fourth element she hadn't seen yet, or survivors from the earlier assaults regrouping. Either way, Danny was alone on the west approach with 1 rifle. How far? Maybe 40 meters below me. Moving slow. They don't know I'm here. Don't fire until the lead man is 20 meters, she said. And Danny, after you fire, move immediately. Don't stay in the same position. Copy. She kept her eyes on the ridge below, managing the Southern group's remnants, watching the assault element's overall posture for the signs that told her whether they were about to push again or consolidate and wait. They were consolidating, which was the right call from a tactical standpoint, and also told her something important. The assault element was running low on its own operational capacity. 6 hours of sustained combat against a position that had absorbed everything they threw at it was taking a toll she hadn't been able to measure from the outside. They weren't broken, but they were tired. And then Mercer's voice, very quiet, came across the radio with the specific quality of someone delivering news they've been holding. Rachel, I just got a communication from command. Reinforcements are 40 minutes out. Weather window opened up. Helicopters are airborne. She processed this. 40 minutes. It was a number with weight on both ends. Heavy enough that 40 minutes felt like an enormous distance to travel through what was left of this fight. Light enough that 40 minutes was a finite thing, a countable thing, in a way that hold until reinforcement had not been. How is the platoon? She asked. Mercer ran through it. His voice was careful and she understood why. 2 soldiers had not survived the close contact fighting when the assault breached the ridge. 4 more were wounded badly enough that they were at the secondary position rather than the line. Webb was still functional with a sidearm. Reyes had taken a round through the upper arm and was fighting through it. Ortega was out of machine gun ammunition and using his rifle. 7 effectives. Plus Rachel on the summit shelf with a torn shoulder and a bleeding leg and a forearm that had stiffened in the cold to something below full function. 8 people between the medical bunker and everything trying to reach it. 40 minutes, she said, and the words were as much to herself as to Mercer. 40 minutes, he confirmed. She did the math on her remaining ammunition one more time. She did it precisely without softening the number because softening numbers was how people died. The number was not comfortable. It was not, however, 0. And as long as it wasn't 0, she had work to do. Mercer, she said, tell the platoon 40 minutes. Everyone holds for 40 minutes and we go home. She heard Mercer relay it across the net, heard the responses come back one by one, Reyes tight and pained but present. Webb young and resolute. Ortega dry as always, saying only copy in the voice of a man who had decided 40 minutes was a number he could manage. Danny from the west approach breathing steady, watching his sector. She heard Prentice from the medical bunker last. He didn't say anything tactical. He said, tell Sergeant Kane thank you. She heard it. She didn't respond. She turned back to the ridge and began managing what was left of the ammunition with the precision of a person who understands that the distance between enough and not enough is sometimes a single decision made correctly at exactly the right moment. The assault element began moving again at 03:08 hours. Not the frontal element this time. Survivors of the high element reoriented, moving on a new approach. She hadn't fully covered a route that threaded between the summit shelf and the northern ridge, tight and difficult, but viable for soldiers desperate enough to try it. She found them at 25 meters. She fired 3 times. The approach closed. At 0317 hours, a surviving element of the frontal assault made one final push toward the medical bunker, bypassing the ridge entirely and trying to reach it through a gap in the southern defensive line that had opened when 2 of Reyes's soldiers went down. Rachel saw the gap open. She saw the element move for it. She saw exactly what would happen in the next 60 seconds if she didn't act. She had 8 rounds remaining. She used 5 of them. The gap closed. 3 rounds left. She held them. She held them through the silence that followed, through the radio calls back and forth across the ridge, through Danny's quiet voice saying the west approach was clear, through Reyes saying his sector was holding, through Webb saying he could hear helicopter rotors in the distance, not close, not yet, but real actual helicopter rotors somewhere in the storm. 3 rounds. She held them and she waited and she watched every approach, every angle, every piece of terrain she'd been managing for 6 hours, and she held the 3 rounds the way you hold something you are not willing to spend on anything but the thing that matters most. At 0329 hours, a single enemy soldier appeared at the base of the path leading directly to the medical bunker. Just one. Moving carefully. Moving quietly. Not part of any remaining assault element, a survivor or a scout or a man who had decided on his own that the bunker was the objective and was going for it alone while the main force had collapsed into disorganized fire and withdrawal. He was 40 meters from the bunker entrance. He didn't know Rachel was above him. She had 3 rounds and 1 man between the wounded soldiers in that bunker and what the enemy commander had ordered 6 hours ago. Leave no one alive. She fired once, the man went down. 2 rounds remaining. She kept watching. Nothing moved. At 0341 hours, the helicopter rotors stopped being a distant sound and became a close, overwhelming physical thing, the specific sound of rescue arriving after the longest night of her life. She heard the radios explode with traffic, heard Mercer coordinating the landing, heard the voices of people who had been running on fear and training, and the specific human stubbornness that refuses to let other people die if there is anything at all left to spend. And she heard those voices shift register into something she hadn't heard in 6 hours. Relief. She stayed on the summit shelf. She watched the approaches. She held the last 2 rounds. Because until every wounded soldier was on those helicopters, this ridge was still hers to hold, and she was still the person holding it. Her radio crackled one final time. Mercer's voice quieter now, something broken open in it that hadn't been there at the start of the night. Rachel, everyone is loaded, all wounded are on the birds. We're ready for you to come down. She looked at the 2 rounds in her hand. She looked at the ridge, at the approaches she'd been covering for 6 hours, at the frozen mountain where 3 assault waves had climbed and failed, and where the names of people she'd protected were already written into something permanent, even if nobody would ever put words to it exactly. She loaded the 2 rounds back into the magazine, set her rifle carefully against the rock, and began the climb down. Her shoulder failed halfway. She slid the last 6 meters on her back in her good arm and came to a stop at the base of the summit shelf with her face pointed at a sky full of snow and helicopter noise. Danny Okafor was there. He didn't say anything. He just got his shoulder under her and helped her up, and they walked down the ridge together in the dark, and behind them the summit shelf stood empty and cold and still, and the valley below was quiet for the first time since before sunrise. 40 meters from the helicopter, Rachel stopped walking. Danny stopped with her. What is it? She looked back at the ridge. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for. Maybe she was just making sure it was still there, that it had held, that the thing she'd given 6 hours and 2 rounds, and most of what she had to defend was still standing. It was. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she turned back toward the helicopter and kept walking. The helicopter set down in Anchorage at 0512 hours. Rachel was conscious for the landing and unconscious before they got her through the hospital doors. Not from blood loss alone, though the blood loss was significant enough that the flight medic had used his entire emergency supply on her before they were halfway to Anchorage. It was everything together. 6 hours of sustained combat. 3 injuries managed past their reasonable limit. The specific kind of physical collapse that only happens when a body has been running on something beyond adrenaline and finally recognizes that the thing it was protecting is safe. She let go, and she went somewhere dark and quiet for a while. The surgical team worked on her shoulder for 4 hours. The fragment from the mortar blast had done more damage than she'd allowed herself to acknowledge on the ridge. Torn the rotator cuff in 2 places, chipped the humeral head, and left a channel of tissue damage that the surgeon later described to her attending nurse as the kind of injury she'd expect from someone who had been shot, not from shrapnel. The fact that Rachel had continued firing a precision rifle for 3 hours after sustaining it was a detail the surgeon mentioned twice, both times in a tone that suggested she wasn't entirely sure she believed it, despite having the imaging in front of her. The leg wound was cleaned and closed. The forearm was a deep bruise and a partial muscle tear that would heal on its own in 6 to 8 weeks. The collection of smaller lacerations, abrasions, and impact injuries across the rest of her body were cataloged and treated in order of priority, which meant some of them were still being addressed when she woke up. She woke up on the afternoon of the second day. The first thing she was aware of was the ceiling. White, institutional. The specific overhead lighting of a military hospital that she'd seen before years ago in Germany after Eastern Europe. She recognized it without needing to read the signs or ask anyone where she was. The second thing she was aware of was that someone was in the chair beside her bed. She turned her head. It took more effort than it should have, which told her what the medication level was without needing to check the IV. Danny Okafor was asleep in the chair, still in his combat uniform, which meant he hadn't been to a bunk yet. His head was tilted back at an angle that was going to give him a serious neck problem when he woke up, and he had a half-eaten protein bar in his hand that had been there long enough to leave a wrapper crease on his palm. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said quietly, "Danny." He woke up the way combat soldiers wake up fast, completely eyes open and oriented, before his body had finished moving. He saw her. His face did something complicated that moved through relief and exhaustion, and something younger than either before settling into an expression she didn't have a word for. "You're awake," he said. "The ridge," she said. "Tell me." He sat forward. "Everyone made it out. All 7 wounded, including Prentice's 2 critical patients. Both of them." He paused, watching her face. The ridge held Sergeant Kane. Every American soldier came home. She closed her eyes, not from pain, from the specific physical weight of relief when you have been holding something for a very long time, and someone tells you it's okay to put it down. She kept her eyes closed for 4 seconds. Then she opened them. "Reyes," she said. "Arm wound. He's 2 rooms down. He's been talking constantly since he got out of surgery, which the nurses are treating as a complication, but the doctors say is a good sign." "Webb. Fine, physically fine. He's been quiet." Danny paused. "He asked me to tell you something when you woke up." "What?" "He said to tell you that 60 seconds works. He said you'd know what that meant." She knew what it meant. She also knew what it cost a 19-year-old boy to learn it the way Marcus Webb had learned it, and she made a note to find him before she was discharged and have the conversation that came after the 60 seconds, the one about what you do with all the seconds that follow. "Ortega," she said. "Ortega is fine and deeply annoyed about his machine gun," Danny said. "He says he wants it on record that he would have held the eastern approach longer if command had given him more ammunition belts. He told me to tell you that specifically." "That sounds right," she said. "And Prentice," Danny said, and something in his voice shifted. "Prentice came out here this morning. He sat in that chair for 2 hours before I got here. He didn't leave a message. He just sat here for 2 hours and then went back to his patients." She absorbed this quietly. She thought about Prentice's voice on the radio during the worst of the 3rd assault. "I am putting everything on you right now. Everything." She thought about what it cost a medic to say those words, a man whose entire professional identity was built around the belief that he was the one who kept people alive, saying out loud that the keeping was in someone else's hands. She'd carry that too. She'd been carrying things for a long time. She had room. "Danny," she said, "how are you?" He was quiet for a moment. The question had caught him in a place he hadn't expected to be caught, and she watched him decide whether to give her the easy answer or the real one. He gave her the real one. "I don't know yet," he said. I keep going back to the West approach. To that moment, I knew what I had to do, and I did it, and it was the right thing, and I understand why." He stopped. "But understanding why doesn't make it simple." "No," she said. "It doesn't. Does it get simpler?" She thought about the same question he'd asked her at the start of the night before the first shot was fired when he was a soldier who had never been in combat, and she was a soldier who carried the weight of having been in too much of it. The understanding gets deeper, she said. That's different from simpler, but it's something. He nodded slowly. Can I ask you something? Yes. On the summit shelf, when you came over the lip exposed, when you went up the ridge with the mortar team ranging in on you. He paused. Were you scared then? She thought about the honest answer. Yes, she said, every time. You didn't sound it. I told you a long time ago, she said. Sounding scared doesn't help anything. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she didn't expect. You kept us alive. All of us. I want you to know that I know that. Not because command will put it in a report or because someone will give you a medal. I know it because I was there and I watched you do it, and I will never forget what that looked like. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. She had not cried on the ridge. She had not cried in the helicopter. She was not going to cry in a hospital bed in front of a private first class, which was a decision she made and kept. But she felt it. Go get some sleep, she said. You look terrible. You look worse, he said. I was in surgery for 4 hours. Fair point. He stood stretching his neck with a sound that confirmed her prediction about the chair angle. I'll come back. You don't have to. I know, he said. I'm going to anyway. He left. She lay in the quiet hospital room and listened to the sounds of the building around her, distant voices, equipment beeping somewhere down the hall, the particular institutional hum of a place that existed to repair people. She'd been in rooms like this before. She'd always left them as quickly as she could because rooms like this had too much quiet and too little to do, and quiet without purpose was where the things she carried got loudest. This time the quiet felt different. She wasn't sure why, exactly. Nothing had changed about what she carried. The faces were still there. The 5 men from Eastern Europe were still there, still as present as they had always been, still the weight she'd been moving under for 3 years. But something around the edges of that weight had shifted. She lay there thinking about it carefully, the way she thought about things that mattered, and after a while she understood what it was. On that ridge, she had done the thing she hadn't been able to do in Eastern Europe. She had stayed. She had made the decision to hold the position, to not break contact, to put herself between the threat and the people who couldn't protect themselves, and she had held it all the way through to the end. Not perfectly, not without cost, not in a way that would look clean in any after-action report, but she had stayed, and everyone behind her had come home. It didn't erase Eastern Europe. She wasn't naive enough to believe in erasure. The 5 men were still 5 men, and she had still made the call she'd made, and they had still not come home because of it. That was permanent. That was real. She wouldn't insult their memory by pretending otherwise. But for the first time in 3 years, the weight felt like something she could carry forward instead of something that was only pulling her back. She was still thinking about this when Lieutenant Cole Mercer knocked on the open door of her room. She heard the knock and turned her head. Mercer was in clean uniform, which meant he'd been to a bunk at some point, but the uniform didn't fully cover what 6 hours on Blackstone Ridge had done to his face. He looked older than he had on the helicopter pad before deployment. Not in a bad way, in the way that people look when they've revised something fundamental about their understanding of the world, and the revision has taken up permanent residence. He stood in the doorway for a moment. You're awake, he said. That's what Danny said. He almost smiled, came into the room, stood near the foot of the bed rather than sitting the way people stand when they're holding something they've been rehearsing. I need to tell you something, Mercer said. All right. Before we deployed, I told you the ridge would collapse under pressure. I told you you couldn't hold it alone. He stopped, looked at a point slightly past her shoulder. I was wrong about what you could do. I want to say that directly. She looked at him. You don't need to, she started. I do, he said. I do need to, because I didn't just doubt the mission or the tactical situation. I doubted you specifically, and I want to be honest about that. He finally looked at her directly. I had assumptions about what a soldier in your position could carry. I was wrong about every one of them. She held his gaze. I heard what you told Webb, Mercer said, about the 60 seconds. I heard what you told Prentice when he called. I heard every radio call you made for 6 hours, and not once did you ask us to come get you. Not once did you tell us you were done." He paused. "I need to know how you did that." She thought about the real answer. She thought about Eastern Europe and 5 faces and 3 years of a wait that had taught her something she couldn't have learned any other way. That the thing which keeps you moving when everything says stop is not fearlessness, is not training alone, is not physical capacity. It is the specific and uncomplicated fact of the people behind you who cannot move if you don't. "Because they were behind me," she said. Mercer was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded once slowly, the way people nod when they've heard something that reorganized something inside them. "The Army is going to want to debrief you extensively," he said. "Command is Rachel. Command is having a significant reaction to the intelligence assessment. Enemy radio intercepts from the battle. Their commander spent most of the assault convinced they were fighting a coordinated American sniper team of 15 to 20 operators." He paused. "When they found out it was one person, they went quiet for about 4 minutes. The intercept team said they've never heard an enemy command element go quiet like that before." She processed this. She didn't feel pride exactly. Something adjacent to it, but quieter. More like the satisfaction of a problem solved, the specific relief of a calculation that came out right when there was no room for it to come out wrong. "The two critical patients," she said, "Prentice's patients. Are they both stable?" Mercer said immediately. "One of them is going to need significant rehabilitation. The other one, the one Prentice said would not survive being moved and is going to make a full recovery. The doctors say the fact that he was in the bunker's rear wall when the assault hit the east face is the reason he's alive. You told Prentice to move them." "I told Danny to tell Prentice," she said. "Same thing," Mercer said. She looked at the ceiling again. She thought about the sequence of small decisions that had led to that moment, telling Danny to go to the bunker. Danny relaying the message, Prentice moving patients, patients surviving because of a wall instead of dying because of the alternative. She thought about how many of those small decisions had been made in the middle of firing sequences and mortar impacts, in the high-element engagement, in every other thing that had been demanding her full attention simultaneously. She thought about how close each of those decisions had been to not being made, how thin the margin was between the outcome and a different outcome. And she made herself sit with that thinness without letting it become something it wasn't. The margin had been thin. The decisions had been made anyway. That was the job. That was all it ever was. Make the next decision, then the next, then the next, and keep making them until there are no more to make. 3 weeks passed. The rehabilitation on her shoulder started on day 4, which was earlier than the surgical team recommended, and exactly when Rachel told them it was going to start. The physical therapist assigned to her, a calm woman named Dr. Ewan, who had worked with combat veterans for 15 years, took one look at Rachel's face during the first session and made a professional decision not to argue about the timeline. She did, however, make Rachel promise to tell her when the pain crossed from productive discomfort to actual damage. "Define the difference," Rachel said. "Productive discomfort is the feeling of tissue being rebuilt," Dr. Ewan said. "Actual damage is the feeling of tissue being destroyed." "I know the difference," Rachel said. "I believe you," Dr. Ewan said. "Which is exactly why I'm asking you to tell me, because people who know the difference are more likely to push into the second category and tell themselves it's still the first." Rachel looked at her. "You're perceptive," Rachel said. "You're my 4th combat sniper this year," Dr. Ewan said. "I've learned." The rehabilitation was hard in a different way than the Ridge had been hard. The Ridge had been immediate threat, decision, action, repeat. This was slow and incremental, and required a patience she had to consciously rebuild day by day, because patience with her own recovery did not come as naturally as patience behind a rifle scope. Marcus Webb came to see her on the 5th day. He knocked on the physical therapy room door while she was mid-session, and Dr. Ewan waved him in. He sat in a chair near the wall and watched her work through the exercises without speaking for the first few minutes. He looked like he'd slept finally. He looked like someone who had done a great deal of thinking in a short period of time and was still sorting through the results. When Dr. Ewan stepped out to get something, Webb spoke. "I wanted to say thank you," he said. "I don't know if that's the right thing to say. I've been trying to figure out the right thing to say for 5 days." "Thank you is fine," Rachel said. She kept working her shoulder through the range of motion, controlled and slow. How are you sleeping? He thought about the answer. Not great. I keep going back to certain moments, specific things I saw or did. I don't know how to turn it off. You don't turn it off, she said. You learn to let it come and go instead of fighting it. Fighting it makes it louder. He absorbed this. How long does that take, learning that? It varies, she said honestly. Are you? He stopped. Do you still have things like that after all your experience? She paused in her exercise. She thought about Eastern Europe, about the faces she'd been carrying for 3 years, about the way the weight of them had shifted slightly, not gone, not lighter exactly, but oriented differently since the ridge. Yes, she said, I still have things like that. Does it get easier? I'm going to tell you the same thing I told Danny, she said. The understanding gets deeper. That's real. It's not the same as easier, but it's something you can work with. Webb sat with this for a moment. Then on the ridge, when everything went sideways and I was almost out of ammunition and I couldn't see anyone and I didn't know what was happening, I kept saying 60 seconds to myself, just 60 seconds. And it worked. He paused. Where did you learn that? She thought about where she'd learned it. She thought about a mountain in Eastern Europe and a decision and 5 men and 3 years of figuring out how to keep moving when moving felt impossible. She thought about the specific way that surviving impossible things teaches you if you're paying attention. Not that you're invincible, but that the next 60 seconds is always survivable. Experience, she said. He nodded, sat quietly for another minute. Then he said the thing she hadn't expected him to say. I want to stay in the Army. I know I almost broke a dozen times that night. I know I wasn't. He stopped. I want to be better at this. I want to be the kind of soldier that doesn't need someone else to hold the whole thing together. She stopped her exercise entirely, looked at him directly. Webb, she said, nobody holds the whole thing together alone. Not in the way you mean. She paused. What you saw me do on that ridge was not something one person is supposed to do. It was not the model. It was the exception. The model is a full team, full support, full resources. She let that land. What matters is that when the exception happened, when everything fell to one position and one rifle, the rest of this platoon held their sectors, made their shots, and didn't break. That includes you, with an empty rifle and a sidearm at the end. That's not nothing, Webb. That's actually everything. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, yes, Sergeant. And for the first time since she'd met him on the helicopter pad in the storm, the words didn't sound like a 19-year-old trying to sound older. They sounded like a soldier. The intelligence debrief happened on day 8. 3 analysts, 1 general officer, 2 people in civilian clothes whose affiliations were not introduced. A room with no windows. 6 hours of questions. They were interested in her movement patterns, the constant repositioning that had caused the enemy to believe they were facing a coordinated multi-team sniper deployment. They showed her the intercepts, enemy communications translated describing the engagement from the other side. She read them carefully. The first intercept from the initial assault described a sniper team of unknown size operating from multiple positions. The assessment estimated 4 to 6 shooters based on the rate of fire and the variety of firing positions. The second intercept from the middle of the second assault had revised the estimate upward. The enemy commander was now describing what he believed was a full American Special Operations Overwatch element of 10 to 15 personnel. The third intercept, the one that had gone around the intelligence community before she was even out of surgery, was from the third assault. The enemy commander, speaking to what appeared to be a superior, had said that the American defensive position was more heavily manned than initial intelligence suggested, that they appeared to have unlimited sniper resources, and that he was requesting additional forces before making another attempt. It was the intercept from after the battle, after the helicopters had come, and the enemy had moved through the position that had created the silence Mercer described. The after-action assessment from the enemy side pieced together from field communications that concluded the Americans had deployed somewhere between 20 and 40 sniper operators to defend the ridge. The intelligence analyst who read it to her paused at that number. 20 to 40, he said. That was their best assessment of the force that opposed them. Rachel said nothing. The actual number, the analyst said slowly, was 1. The room was quiet. The general officer who had been making notes throughout the debrief put his pen down. He looked at Rachel directly for a long moment with the specific expression of someone who has spent their career around extraordinary soldiers and is encountering something that sits outside the frame of even that experience. He said, "Sergeant Kane, is there anything you need?" She thought about the question. She thought about her shoulder, which was coming back slowly and would come back fully. Dr. Ewan had confirmed, though it would take time. She thought about her platoon Webb finding his footing, Danny processing the West approach in the way that would take months but would get there. Reyes already making jokes about his arm in a way that meant he was fine. Ortega already putting in requests for better machine gun ammunition supply protocols. She thought about Prentice's two critical patients, both stable, one already asking when he could go back to his unit. She thought about 5 faces from Eastern Europe. She thought about a ridge in Alaska that had held when everything said it shouldn't. "No," she said, "I don't need anything." The general nodded. The debrief continued. 6 weeks after the battle, after her shoulder had progressed far enough that Dr. Ewan had declared the rate of recovery medically improbable and personally impressive, a ceremony was held. Not a large ceremony. The Army was careful about the classified nature of the engagement and the intelligence sensitivities around the details. A small gathering. The platoon, those who were present and able, several senior officers, a citation that described the action in terms carefully chosen to convey significance without specifics. Rachel stood in her dress uniform and listened to the citation read aloud and felt the same way she always felt at ceremonies, present, but slightly outside the moment, the way you stand outside a building you lived in and look at it from the street. Reyes was beside her, arm in a sling. He was already arguing with the doctors about removing early. He leaned toward her during the reading and whispered, "They're describing the battle very diplomatically." "Yes," she said. "They said you demonstrated exceptional resilience under sustained hostile pressure." "Yes. That is," Reyes said quietly, "the most spectacular understatement I have encountered in 11 years of military service." She kept her face forward. "Reyes," she said, "Sergeant Kane, be quiet." "Yes, Sergeant." After the ceremony, she stood alone near the far edge of the room, while the group broke into smaller conversations around her. She was holding a cup of coffee she hadn't drunk, looking at nothing in particular, processing the specific feeling of a thing being formally acknowledged that had already been real for weeks. Mercer found her there. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking. They'd talked several times since the hospital, short conversations, professional, the kind that happen between soldiers who have been through something together and are still figuring out the language for it. Then he said, "I've been thinking about something you said in the hospital." "Which thing?" "When I asked how you held the ridge," he said, "you said because they were behind you." He paused. "I've been thinking about that, about what that means for the people in front of you." She looked at him. "There were soldiers on that ridge," Mercer said, "who held their positions because you were in front of them. Webb held because you were in front of him. Reyes, Danny, all of them, they held because the person in front of them hadn't stopped." He paused. "You were behind them and in front of them at the same time." She hadn't thought about it in those terms. She stood there and let the idea settle the way she let things settle. That needed time, not pushing it, not resolving it immediately, just letting it exist in the space around everything else she was carrying. "I was just doing the job," she said. "I know," Mercer said. "That's what makes it mean something." 7 months later, Rachel stood on Blackstone Ridge. The war front had moved east as predicted. The radar station was being decommissioned. The Army had arranged a small memorial for the 2 soldiers who had not come home from the ridge, and she had come back for it. The ceremony was brief. The words were right. She stood with the platoon, those who were still assigned nearby, those who had come from other posts to be present. Webb was there, taller somehow, or maybe just different in the way he carried himself. Danny was there, quieter than he'd been, the kind of quiet that comes from something processed rather than suppressed. Ortega was there, and Reyes and Prentice, who had driven 8 hours to attend. After the ceremony, the group moved toward the vehicles. Rachel stayed. She stood on the ridge alone and looked at the valley below. At the frozen paths she'd been watching through a scope for 6 hours on the worst night of this ridge's history. At the western approach where the first assault had collapsed. At the river delta where the armor had stalled. At the eastern face where the special operations element had climbed and failed. At the summit shelf above her where she'd held the last position with 2 rounds in her rifle and the sound of helicopter rotors somewhere in the storm. She stood there for a long time, The wind moved across the ridge, the way wind moves across high places without direction, without purpose, just moving, because that is what wind does. She thought about the 5 men from Eastern Europe. She thought about them differently than she had for 3 years. Not with the pull of guilt that said she should have stayed, should have done more, should have found a way to bring all of them home. She thought about them as men. She had known men who had made their own decisions on that mountain and would have made them again because they understood what the mission required. She thought about what they would say if they could see this ridge. She thought they would say she held it. She reached into her jacket pocket. She took out 2 rifle rounds, the 2 she hadn't fired. The last 2 from Blackstone Ridge, which she'd kept without fully knowing why, the way you keep certain things that have no practical value but carry a weight beyond their physical existence. She held them in her palm for a moment. Then she closed her hand around them and put them back in her pocket. She would keep them. Not as a trophy, not as a reminder of the things she'd survived, as something that meant what it meant, that there had been enough, that the math had worked out, that the people behind her had come home. Danny's voice came from somewhere down the slope behind her. "Sergeant Kane, vehicles are ready." She looked at the valley one more time. Then she turned away from the ridge and walked back toward the people who were waiting. Some battles are won by armies, by superior numbers, by technology and firepower, and the weight of overwhelming force. History records those battles in broad strokes, the dates, the maps, the commanders' names. But some battles are different. Some battles are won in the space between one heartbeat and the next, in the decision a single person makes to hold a position, when the position cannot be held to fire one more shot, when there are no more shots to stay, when every reasonable calculation says go. Blackstone Ridge was that kind of battle, and the woman who held it was not fearless. She was not superhuman. She was not made of different material than the people around her. She simply refused to leave. And sometimes in the long history of impossible things that human beings have done for each other, that refusal is enough. It was enough.